Iran has a long and fascinating history, one that stretches back thousands of years. This ancient land has been a cradle of civilization, a melting pot of cultures, and a battleground for empires. From the majestic peaks of the Alborz Mountains to the vast deserts of Dashti Kavir, Iran's diverse landscapes have witnessed the rise and fall of many great powers. In the early 1800s, Iran was a strategically important region. Its location made it a focal point for the ambitions of several powerful empires. The country was situated at a critical juncture, connecting the East and the West, and serving as a bridge between different cultures and economies. It was located at the crossroads of several empires. This unique position made Iran a coveted prize for those seeking to expand their influence and control over the region. The land was not only rich in resources but also held immense strategic value. The Ottoman Empire was to the west. This powerful empire, with its vast territories and military might, had long been a dominant force in the region. The Ottomans were keenly aware of Iran's strategic importance and sought to exert their influence over it. The Russian Empire was to the north. Russia, with its expanding borders and imperial ambitions, viewed Iran as a gateway to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and the riches of the Indian subcontinent. The Russians were determined to secure their southern frontier and extend their reach into Central Asia. The British Empire had a growing presence in India to the east. The British, with their vast colonial holdings, were deeply invested in maintaining their dominance in the Indian Ocean and protecting their trade routes. Iran's proximity to India made it a region of significant interest to British strategists. This made Iran a prize sought after by many. The country's strategic location and abundant resources attracted the attention of these powerful empires, each vying for control and influence. The resulting conflicts and power struggles would shape the course of Iran's history for decades to come. Iran's location made it a vital trade route. For centuries, caravans laden with goods traveled through its territory, connecting the markets of the east with those of the west. The Silk Road, one of the most famous trade routes in history, passed through Iran, bringing wealth and prosperity to the region. Goods flowed between east and west through its territory. Spices, silk, precious metals and other valuable commodities were exchanged in bustling bazaars and markets. This trade not only enriched the local economy, but also facilitated cultural exchanges and the spread of ideas. This brought wealth to the region. The prosperity generated by trade allowed for the flourishing of arts, architecture, and learning. Magnificent palaces, mosques, and gardens were built, reflecting the opulence and sophistication of Iranian society during this period. It also attracted the attention of powerful nations seeking to control these trade routes. European powers, recognizing the strategic and economic importance of Iran, began to establish diplomatic and military presence in the region. Their involvement would have profound implications for Iran's sovereignty and future. The rulers of Iran had to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape. They were caught between the competing interests of the Ottoman, Russian, and British empires, each of which sought to exert its influence over the region. The challenge was to maintain Iran's independence while managing these external pressures. The Qajar dynasty ruled Iran at this time. The Qajars, who came to power in the late 18th century, faced the daunting task of steering the country through this turbulent period. Their reign was marked by efforts to modernize the state and strengthen its institutions, while also dealing with internal and external challenges. They were facing internal and external pressures. Internally, the Qajar rulers had to contend with economic difficulties, tribal unrest, and demands for reform. Externally, they were under constant threat from the ambitions of their powerful neighbors. Internally, they grappled with economic challenges and tribal dynamics. The country's economy was struggling, and there were frequent conflicts between the central government and various tribal leaders. These internal divisions weakened the state and made it more vulnerable to external threats. Externally, they had to contend with the ambitions of their powerful neighbors. The Ottomans, Russians, and British were all vying for influence in Iran, each seeking to advance their own strategic interests. This created a highly volatile and competitive environment. The Qajar rulers tried to maintain their independence. They engaged in a delicate balancing act, playing the different empires off against each other in an attempt to preserve Iran's sovereignty. This required skillful diplomacy and strategic maneuvering. They played the different empires off against each other. By forging alliances and making concessions, the Qajar rulers sought to navigate the complex web of international relations. However, this strategy was fraught with risks and often led to unintended consequences. However, this balancing act was becoming increasingly difficult. The pressures from external powers were mounting, and the internal challenges were growing more severe. The Qajar rulers found it increasingly hard to maintain their grip on power and protect the country's interests. The Great Game, a rivalry between Britain and Russia for supremacy in Central Asia, was in full swing. This geopolitical struggle had far-reaching implications for Iran, as both empires sought to expand their influence in the region. The competition between Britain and Russia intensified, leading to increased foreign intervention in Iran's affairs. Iran, caught in the middle, became a pawn in this struggle for power. The country's strategic location made it a key battleground in the Great Game, with both Britain and Russia seeking to gain the upper hand. This had a profound impact on Iran's political and economic stability. The decisions made in this period would have lasting consequences for Iran's future. The legacy of the Qajar dynasty, the impact of foreign intervention, and the geopolitical dynamics of the 19th century would shape the course of Iran's history for generations to come. The crossroads of empires, Iran's story is one of resilience, adaptation, and enduring significance in the global arena. The Qajar dynasty ruled Iran from 1789 to 1925. This period was marked by significant challenges and transformations that shaped the course of Iranian history. They faced a difficult task. The Qajar rulers inherited a nation that was fragmented and weakened by internal strife and external pressures. The country was surrounded by powerful empires. The Russian Empire to the north and the British Empire to the south were both eager to expand their influence in the region. They were all trying to increase their influence in the region. This geopolitical tug-of-war placed immense pressure on the Qajar rulers, who had to navigate a complex web of diplomacy and power politics. The Qajars struggled to maintain Iran's independence. They engaged in numerous diplomatic efforts, attempting to play the British and Russians against each other to preserve their sovereignty. They tried to play the different powers off against each other. This strategy, however, was fraught with risks and often led to concessions that undermined their authority. The Qajar period was also marked by internal instability. The central government struggled to exert control over the vast and diverse territories of Iran. The country was vast and diverse. From the arid deserts to the lush northern forests, the geographical diversity was matched by a complex social fabric. Different ethnic groups and tribes had their own power bases. These groups often resisted central authority, leading to frequent uprisings and local conflicts. This made it hard for the central government to exert control. The Qajar administration was often seen as weak and ineffective, struggling to implement reforms and maintain order. The economy was largely agrarian. The majority of the population depended on agriculture for their livelihood. It was heavily dependent on agriculture. This reliance on farming made the economy vulnerable to environmental factors. This made it vulnerable to droughts and other natural disasters. Periodic droughts could devastate crops, leading to food shortages and economic hardship. Despite these challenges, the Qajars did achieve some notable things. They made efforts to promote trade and commerce, recognizing the importance of economic development. They promoted trade and commerce. The establishment of new trade routes and bazaars helped to stimulate economic activity and connect Iran with global markets. They tried to modernize the army and the administration. These efforts were aimed at strengthening the state's capacity to defend its territory and govern effectively. They also oversaw a flowering of Persian art and culture. The Qajar era saw significant contributions to literature, architecture, and the arts, leaving a lasting cultural legacy. However, their efforts at reform were often too little, too late. The pace of change was slow and many of the reforms failed to address the underlying issues facing the country. By the late 19th century, Iran was facing a severe crisis. The combination of internal strife, economic difficulties, and external pressures had brought the country to the brink. The government was deeply in debt. Financial mismanagement and costly wars had drained the state's coffers. It had been forced to grant concessions to foreign powers. These concessions often involved giving up control over key resources and industries. This gave them control over key industries like oil and tobacco. The loss of these vital sectors further weakened the Qajar state's economic independence. These concessions were deeply unpopular with the Iranian people. Many saw them as a betrayal of national interests and a sign of the government's weakness. They saw them as a betrayal of national sovereignty. This sentiment fueled widespread discontent and a growing sense of nationalism. This resentment fueled a growing nationalist movement. Intellectuals, clerics, and ordinary citizens began to call for greater autonomy and resistance against foreign domination. The stage was set for a major upheaval. The early 20th century would see significant political and social changes, culminating in the eventual fall of the Qajar dynasty and the rise of a new era in Iranian history. As the 19th century progressed, the influence of colonial powers on Iran grew. The country found itself increasingly entangled in the geopolitical ambitions of foreign empires, each vying for control and influence over the region. This period marked the beginning of a long and complex struggle for Iran's sovereignty and self-determination. Russia and Britain, engaged in their great game, saw Iran as a strategic buffer zone. This rivalry was not just a matter of political maneuvering but also involved economic exploitation and military interventions. The two powers were determined to outmaneuver each other, often disregarding the impact on the Iranian people and their way of life. They sought to advance their interests, often at Iran's expense. The Iranian landscape, rich in resources and strategically located, became a battleground for these colonial ambitions. The local population bore the brunt of these power struggles, facing economic hardship and social disruption. Russia, expanding its empire southward, aimed to control access to the Persian Gulf. This expansion was part of a broader strategy to secure warm water ports and enhance its naval capabilities. The presence of Russian troops and administrators in northern Iran became a common sight, symbolizing the growing foreign dominance. Britain, concerned with protecting its interests in India, sought to counter Russian influence. The British were equally determined to maintain their dominance in the region, fearing that Russian control over Iran would threaten their colonial holdings in South Asia. This led to a series of diplomatic and military maneuvers aimed at curbing Russian advances. This rivalry had a profound impact on Iran's development. The Qajar rulers, caught between these two powerful empires, struggled to maintain their authority and independence. The constant pressure from both sides hindered Iran's ability to modernize and develop its own political and economic systems. The Qajar government, weakened by internal divisions and financial woes, found it increasingly difficult to resist foreign pressure. Corruption and mismanagement further eroded the state's capacity to govern effectively. The ruling elite often resorted to granting concessions to foreign powers in exchange for financial support, deepening the country's dependency. Concessions granted to foreign companies, particularly in the lucrative oil industry, further eroded Iran's economic independence. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century attracted even more foreign interest, leading to exploitative agreements that favored foreign companies at the expense of Iran's own economic interests. This foreign interference fueled resentment among Iranians. The population grew increasingly aware of the exploitation and began to demand greater control over their own resources and political destiny. The sense of injustice and national humiliation became a powerful motivator for change. The granting of concessions sparked widespread protests. These protests were not just about economic grievances, but also about national pride and the desire for self-determination. The Iranian people were no longer willing to accept foreign domination and the subservience of their government to external powers. Many felt that the Qajar government was selling out the country's resources for its own gain. The ruling class's willingness to compromise with foreign powers was seen as a betrayal of the nation's interests. This perception of betrayal only intensified the public's desire for change. The sense of national humiliation was palpable. The Iranian people, proud of their rich history and cultural heritage, found the subjugation by foreign powers deeply offensive. This collective sense of humiliation and the desire to restore national dignity became a unifying force. This growing discontent laid the groundwork for a movement for fundamental change. The seeds of revolution were sown, as various groups began to organize and articulate their demands for a more just and independent Iran. This period of unrest and activism set the stage for the significant political transformations that would follow in the 20th century. The early 20th century witnessed the rise of a powerful nationalist movement in Iran. The Constitutional Revolution of 1906 was a pivotal moment in this struggle. Fueled by anger over foreign interference and government corruption, Iranians from all walks of life demanded change. Merchants, intellectuals, and religious leaders united in their call for a more just and accountable government. The revolution forced the Qajar rulers to accept a constitution. This established a parliament, the Majlis, as a check on the Shah's power. It guaranteed basic rights and freedoms. This was a landmark achievement. It marked the beginning of a new era in Iranian history. However, the path to democracy was far from smooth. The revolution faced resistance from conservative forces within the Qajar court, and from foreign powers wary of a strong, independent Iran. The Majlis struggled to assert its authority. The country remained plagued by internal divisions and external pressures.